The alien ships appeared on a Tuesday morning without warning, and the entire solar system lit up with sensor alerts that made every screen on Earth flash red with danger. Commander Jake Morrison was drinking coffee at Orbital Station Sentinel when the threat board painted itself with 300 massive warships that had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel near Neptune. Each ship was the size of a small moon, and they sat there in space like silent giants waiting for something to happen. Jake put down his coffee cup and watched the numbers climb on his display while his heart started beating faster in his chest. Lieutenant Amy Collins worked at her station with quick fingers and told him they were counting 300 capital ships and maybe more coming through. The station had only been operational for 8 months, and now they were facing something that looked impossible to fight. Jake asked if the aliens were trying to talk to them, but Amy shook her head and said they were just sitting out there doing nothing. For 3 long hours, humanity waited and watched those ships while every government on Earth scrambled to figure out what to do. Then the message came through in perfect English that had been translated by technology humans could not even begin to understand. The voice was cold and empty like a machine speaking, and it said that humanity had violated the territorial boundaries of something called the Kithran Dominion. The aliens told Earth that human expansion into space was not authorized and that all colonies had to be surrendered within 72 hours. Every military ship had to be dismantled, and if humanity did not comply, then they would be eliminated completely. Jake felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins when he heard those words. 72 hours to give up everything humanity had built among the stars or face total destruction. He ordered his communications officer to send a message asking for negotiations and more time, but the reply came back within minutes. There would be no negotiation, and humanity would comply or be destroyed. Down on Earth in a bunker hidden beneath the Rocky Mountains, President Helen Carter gathered her cabinet and military commanders in a room that felt too small for the weight of what they were discussing. General Paul Griffin stood up and told everyone that the human fleet was outgunned 7-1, and that their chances of winning a straight fight were basically zero. Helen asked if that meant they should surrender, and Paul said he did not say that at all. He pulled up plans for something called Project Longshot that had been built into the lunar surface 6 years ago. It was a magnetic accelerator weapon powered by a fusion reactor that could fire a 50-ton projectile at 98% the speed of light. The kinetic energy from that impact would be like a large asteroid hitting something. Helen looked at the plans and realized they would have exactly one shot with this weapon. If they missed or if it did not work, then they would have shown their only card and have nothing left to fight with. Paul told her it would take 68 hours to charge the weapon to full power. Helen looked around the table at all the faces watching her and thought about her daughter, who was at college in Boston, completely unaware that humanity might be extinct in 3 days. She made her decision quickly and told them to start charging the weapon immediately. They would send a message to the aliens asking for time to consider the terms and organize evacuations from the colonies. It was a lie to buy time while the weapon charged. Back on the station, Jake watched the alien fleet begin to move through the solar system in a pattern that looked like a blockade. They were spreading out to make sure no human ship could escape. Amy suddenly called out that she was detecting launch signatures from the fleet. Thousands of small fighters were launching and heading straight toward Mars colony. Jake felt his stomach drop because his sister lived on Mars with her family. The aliens were not waiting for any answer from humanity. They were already attacking. He ordered the entire human fleet to launch immediately and intercept those fighters before they reached Mars. Every available ship began burning toward the red planet while Jake opened a direct channel to President Helen Carter. The human fleet consisted of 43 warships that had been built over the past 15 years since humanity found alien technology on Mars and figured out how to reach the stars. Now all those ships were racing toward a battle they could not win against an enemy that had been conquering worlds for thousands of years. Captain Lisa Hayes commanded a ship called the Defiance, and she led the charge toward the incoming fighter swarm. She could see on her tactical display that they were outnumbered 500-1, but there were 50,000 civilians on Mars, including families and children, who had done nothing wrong except be born human. Every ship in the fleet knew they were probably going to die, but not one of them hesitated. They had 70 hours to hold the line until the railgun was ready to fire. 70 hours to keep Earth safe while a weapon that might not even work charged up on the moon. 70 hours to prove that humanity deserved to exist among the stars. Jake watched the fleet accelerate toward the alien fighters and knew that everything was about to change. Either humanity would survive this day, or they would be wiped out like so many other species that had faced the Kethran Dominion. He thought about all the people on Earth looking up at the sky and wondering if those lights they saw were human ships or alien ones. He thought about the children who would grow up in a galaxy that either knew humans as warriors or did not know them at all because they were extinct. The battle was about to begin and there was no turning back now. The aliens had brought war to humanity's doorstep, and humans would answer with everything they had. The human fleet met the alien fighters in the dark space between Mars and Jupiter, where no one could hear the explosions or the screams of dying ships. Captain Lisa Hayes stood on the bridge of the Defiance and gave the order for all ships to open fire with everything they had. Human railguns started spitting tungsten slugs at speeds that could punch through armor like paper, and missiles streaked out from every ship in bright trails of fire. The alien fighters died by the dozens, but for every one that exploded, 2 more appeared from behind it. The Defiance shook hard when plasma bolts slammed into her shields and started burning through the layers of protective energy that kept the crew alive. Lieutenant Chris Palmer called out that their shield generators were down to 40% power, and that the portside weapons batteries had gone offline. Lisa told him to keep firing because they needed to buy Mars Colony as much time as possible, even if it cost them everything. Down on Mars, the colony director Kevin Brooks watched the sky light up with distant explosions that looked like new stars being born and dying in seconds. The colony shields were active, but everyone knew they would not hold for long against a sustained attack from thousands of fighters. Kevin ordered all non-essential personnel to evacuate into the underground shelters that had been built for emergencies, just like this one. His aide told him that the Defiance and the rest of the fleet were engaging the fighters, but they were taking heavy losses. Kevin looked at the evacuation numbers scrolling across his screen and realized they could maybe save 30% of the population before the shields failed. It was not enough and would never be enough, but it was all they could do. In space above Mars, Lisa watched her tactical display as ship after ship winked out of existence when they took too much damage and exploded. 12 human vessels were destroyed in the first 10 minutes, and the aliens were barely even trying. They were playing with the human fleet like a cat plays with a mouse before killing it. Chris told her quietly that they had received orders from Earth Command to fall back immediately. Lisa could not believe what she was hearing and asked, "What about Mars and all those people down there?" Chris said that Earth was activating Project Longshot, and they needed to clear the firing lane between the moon and the alien fleet. Lisa felt something break inside her chest when she realized they were abandoning Mars to save Earth. It was the cold mathematics of survival, and she hated it, but she understood it. She transmitted the order for all ships to fall back to Earth orbit at maximum speed. The human fleet turned and ran while the alien fighters descended on Mars like a swarm of locusts. The colony shields held for exactly 17 minutes before they collapsed under the weight of so many plasma weapons firing at once. What happened next would be called the Mars Massacre, and only a few hundred people survived to tell about it. 50,000 civilians died in less than an hour while the human fleet retreated toward Earth. On the moon at the Project Longshot facility, Dr. Nathan Pierce watched the power levels climb steadily toward full charge. The fusion reactor buried under the lunar surface hummed with energy that could power entire cities, and all of it was being fed into magnetic coils that stretched for 30 kilometers under the rock. His assistant Claire Wilson told him they would be ready to fire in 8 hours. Nathan nodded, but his attention was on the news feeds from Mars that had gone silent 20 minutes ago. 50,000 people gone in an instant because humanity was not strong enough to protect them. He promised himself that the aliens would pay for what they did. Back on Earth, President Helen Carter appeared on every screen around the world to address 7 billion people who now knew they were not alone in the universe, and that their neighbors wanted them dead. She told everyone that humanity faced an enemy who demanded surrender, and wanted humans to abandon the stars and go back to Earth like primitive animals. The aliens had shown their answer by murdering 50,000 people on Mars, but Helen said that humanity does not surrender, and that they did not crawl out of caves and cross oceans and reach the stars just to bow. Before the first bully they met, in 8 hours Earth would deliver its answer to the Kethran Dominion and show them that humans do not kneel. The speech went out across every human colony and every ship and every outpost in space. For the first time in human history, the entire species was united against a common enemy. On orbital station Sentinel Jake watched the alien fleet begin moving toward Earth in a formation that could only mean they were preparing for a final assault. Amy told him the aliens must have monitored the president's speech and knew that humanity was not going to surrender. She calculated that the alien fleet would reach Earth orbit in 6 hours. Jake did the math in his head and realized they would have to hold the line for 2 hours after the aliens arrived before the weapon was ready to fire. 2 hours against an enemy that had just wiped out an entire colony without breaking a sweat. He sent out a message to every remaining ship and every defense platform and every pilot who was still alive. They would make their stand at Earth and either win or die trying. There would be no retreat and no surrender. The Kethran Armada approached Earth like a wall of steel and fire that blocked out the stars. 300 massive warships that had conquered 1,000 worlds were now coming to conquer one more. Lisa positioned the Defiance and 31 surviving ships in high orbit, forming a thin line that everyone knew was mostly symbolic. They were down to 31 ships from 43, and most of them were damaged with ammunition running low. She told her bridge crew that this was it, and there would be no retreat. They would hold this line until Project Longshot was ready, or they would die in the attempt. The alien fleet stopped just beyond weapons range like they wanted humanity to see what was coming and have time to be afraid. Then a transmission cut through every human frequency, with a final warning that told Earth to power down all weapons and prepare for orbital bombardment. President Helen Carter sat in the command bunker surrounded by military advisors and world leaders who were connected through secure channels. Everyone was looking at her and waiting for her decision. She asked Dr. Pierce about the status of the weapon, and he told her they were at 93% charge and could fire in 97 minutes. She asked General Paul Griffin if they could hold that long, and he studied the tactical display with a grim expression before saying he did not know, but they would try. Helen took a deep breath and opened a channel to the alien flagship. She said that she spoke for 7 billion human beings and their answer was no. Humanity would not surrender and would not bow, and they would show the aliens why humans deserved their place among the stars. The response was immediate as the alien fleet opened fire with everything they had. Beams of superheated plasma crossed the void in seconds and slammed into human defense platforms and ships. The Defiance rocked violently as her shields absorbed hit after hit, while warning alarms screamed throughout the ship. Lisa commanded all batteries to return fire with continuous barrage. Human railguns spat tungsten slugs at speeds that could cross the solar system in hours, while missile pods emptied their entire payloads in desperate volleys. The space between Earth and the alien fleet became a hell of explosions and energy beams that created a light show visible from the planet's surface. The human ships fought with a fury born from knowing that behind them was their homeworld with their families and everything they had ever known or loved. Amy reported from Orbital Station Sentinel that the defense platform Aegis had been destroyed and that 2 other platforms had lost main power. The cruiser Valiant was breaking apart and its crew was evacuating in escape pods that would probably be shot down by alien fighters. Jake watched the tactical display as red icons blinked out one by one, showing ships and stations dying every minute. The alien fleet had not even committed its full force yet, and humans were already losing. He asked how long until Project Longshot could fire and was told 73 minutes. On the moon. Nathan Pierce wiped sweat from his forehead as he monitored the charging sequence. The facility shook periodically when debris from the orbital battle rained down on the lunar surface, but the weapon itself was buried too deep to be damaged. Claire announced they were at 98% charge and almost ready. Nathan asked about target acquisition, and she told him they were locked onto the flagship with the computer calculating trajectory and accounting for the ship movement and gravitational effects and even solar wind. They would have one shot and it had to count. Nathan pulled up the view from surface cameras and could see Earth hanging in the black sky looking beautiful and blue, but surrounded by the fire of ships dying. He watched tiny lights wink out as brave men and women sacrificed themselves to buy time for a weapon that might not even work. He promised quietly that it would count, and that the aliens would regret ever coming to this system. In orbit, the Defiance had taken catastrophic damage with her port side completely gone and exposed to vacuum. Fires burned in compartments throughout the ship, and crew members were dying in sections that had lost life support. Lisa Hayes had blood streaming from a cut above her eye but refused to leave her post on the bridge. She asked how many ships were left, and Chris told her 14, and most of those were running on emergency power. She asked how much time, and he said 41 minutes. Lisa looked around her bridge at the young men and women who had become her family over the years. They were all volunteers who knew this might be their last day alive. She transmitted a message to all remaining ships telling them it was time for the final push. They would give everything they had left and make the aliens remember them. The human fleet surged forward in a desperate charge that closed the distance with the alien armada. They fired every weapon and emptied every magazine and burned every reserve of power they had. 3 more ships were destroyed in the first minute, but they managed to damage one of the alien dreadnoughts by scoring a hit on its reactor. The alien ship spiraled out of formation, trailing atmosphere and debris. It was the first real damage humans had inflicted on the enemy, and a cheer went up across what remained of the fleet. They were losing and they were dying, but they had drawn blood. On Earth, billions of people watched the battle through every available feed. In homes and shelters and cities and villages, people held each other and prayed to whatever gods they believed in. Children clutched their parents and asked if the bright lights in the sky meant they would be okay. In the command bunker, Helen Carter stood motionless with her hands clasped behind her back, watching her people die to buy time. General Griffin said quietly that it was 20 minutes until the weapon was ready. On the moon, the moment finally arrived. Claire announced that they had 100% charge and all systems were green. They were ready to fire. Nathan opened a direct channel to Earth and told President Carter that Project Longshot was operational and locked on target. He said they were awaiting her order. Helen looked at the tactical display one last time and saw the human fleet was down to 9 ships and all of them were damaged. The alien flagship sat in the center of its formation looking arrogant and untouchable. She gave the order with one simple word and said fire. Deep beneath the lunar surface, magnetic coils that had taken 6 years to build hummed to life with power that could destroy worlds. The fusion reactor running at 112% capacity pumped energy into the system at a rate that would have powered Earth's entire electrical grid for a month. Dr. Nathan Pierce watched his instruments with held breath as the tungsten carbide projectile shaped like a needle and weighing 50 tons accelerated down the 30-kilometer launch tube. It took 3 seconds to reach 98% the speed of light. The projectile emerged from the lunar surface with no fanfare or flash of light or dramatic announcement. It was simply there one moment and gone the next, crossing the void toward its target faster than anything humanity had ever created. Captain Lisa Hayes saw it first on her sensors as a tiny blip, moving at impossible speed. She had only seconds to react and shouted for all ships to emergency scatter and clear the firing line. The remaining human vessels broke formation and burned their engines at maximum thrust to get out of the projectile's path. The alien fleet detected the launch but did not understand the threat and held their position. The railgun projectile crossed the distance from the moon to the alien flagship in 1.3 seconds. It struck the massive warship dead center and punched through shields and armor and hull as if they were made of paper. The kinetic energy of the impact was beyond anything that could be easily calculated or described. The 50-ton projectile moving at relativistic speed transferred all of its momentum in a single instant. The alien flagship did not explode in a dramatic fireball. It simply ceased to exist. The shockwave from the impact expanded outward in a sphere of superheated plasma and debris that caught the nearest dreadnoughts in its deadly embrace. Shields failed and hulls buckled, and ships that had survived battles across 100 star systems were torn apart like toys. In 3 seconds, 27 alien warships were destroyed. In 10 seconds, the plasma wave had dissipated enough that the surviving vessels could maneuver clear. On the Defiance, Lisa and her crew stared at their displays in stunned silence. Where the center of the alien formation had been, there was now only an expanding cloud of debris and radiation. Chris whispered that they had actually hit them, and his voice was full of disbelief. On Earth, the reaction was instantaneous. From Beijing to New York and from small villages in Africa to research stations in Antarctica, humanity erupted in celebration. People poured into the streets crying and laughing and embracing complete strangers. The impossible had happened, and humanity had struck back against an enemy that seemed unbeatable. But in the command bunker, President Helen Carter was not celebrating. She watched the tactical display with narrowed eyes as the remaining alien ships regrouped. She asked General Griffin what they were doing, and he studied the enemy formation before saying they were withdrawing and pulling back to Neptune's orbit. Helen asked if they were retreating, and Paul said no, they were withdrawing to regroup. The aliens still had 273 capital ships and could still overwhelm Earth if they wanted to. Helen felt the weight settle back on her shoulders. They had won a battle, but not the war. On Orbital Station Sentinel, Jake Morrison reached the same conclusion. He told Amy that the aliens were going to come back harder, and humanity did not have another shot in that railgun. Amy pulled up new sensor data. and told him the alien fleet was receiving transmissions from outside the system. Multiple sources were sending high-power broadcasts to the fleet. Jake asked if she could decode them, and she said she was working on it. What humans did not know was that the destruction of the flagship had been witnessed by observers across a dozen star systems. The aliens had broadcast their assault on humanity as a warning to other species and a demonstration of their power. Instead, they had broadcast their greatest humiliation. On the homeworld of the Kethran Dominion, in a council chamber that had stood for 10,000 years, the High Commanders convened an emergency session. The massive viewscreen showed the replay of the flagship's destruction over and over. High Commander Vex slammed his appendage on the table and demanded to know how a species that only reached the stars 15 years ago had destroyed their flagship. A subordinate replied that analysis indicated a kinetic weapon using mass driver technology, but scaled to proportions that were previously thought impossible. The projectile's velocity was 98% light speed. Vex said that was impossible because the energy requirements alone would be astronomical. The subordinate explained that humans appeared to have dedicated a fusion reactor the size of a city to powering the weapon. It was crude and inefficient and absurdly dangerous. The weapon could have destroyed their own moon if the magnetic containment had failed during firing. Vex studied the data with growing respect. He said that humans had risked their moon and their homeworld and everything they had on a single weapon that might not have worked. And they had fired it without hesitation. Another commander leaned forward and said that their fleet still outnumbered the humans significantly, and they could destroy Earth and eliminate this threat permanently. Vex replied that if they did that, they would become the example used to warn other species about attacking humans. He said they came to the system to subjugate a primitive species, but instead found warriors willing to die to the last for their freedom. Other species were watching and analyzing their response. The other commander asked if they should withdraw and accept defeat. Vex was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said they would withdraw and never speak of this again, but they would remember. The species of Sol 3 had earned something few ever received from the Dominion. They had earned respect. Back in the solar system, the alien fleet continued its withdrawal. Human sensors tracked them as they pulled back beyond Neptune and then beyond the Kuiper Belt. They held position there for 6 hours just at the edge of detection range. Then, without warning or final message, they activated their faster-than-light drives and vanished, leaving only the debris of battle behind. The galaxy had just learned that humanity would fight. 3 days after the battle, Captain Lisa Hayes stood on the observation deck of Orbital Station Sentinel, looking out at Earth. The Defiance was in space dock, undergoing repairs that would take months to complete. She had lost 63 crew members in the battle, including Chris Palmer, who died when the bridge took a direct hit in the final minutes of fighting. Jake Morrison approached quietly and offered her a cup of coffee. He told her she should be resting, but Lisa said she could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ships they lost and the people who would not be coming home. Jake said they saved Earth, and that had to count for something. Lisa turned to face him and asked if it did count. They had fired one weapon and destroyed one ship. If the aliens had pressed the attack, humanity would have lost. They got lucky. Jake suggested that maybe the aliens saw something in humanity that made them think twice about continuing. On Earth, President Helen Carter addressed the United Nations General Assembly in a chamber packed with representatives from every nation. Outside, the entire world watched on screens. Helen began by saying that 3 days ago humanity faced extinction. An alien empire, vast and powerful beyond comprehension, had demanded surrender. They demonstrated their power by massacring 50,000 civilians on Mars. They attacked Earth with overwhelming force. She paused to let the memory settle. Humanity responded with everything they had. Brave men and women in the military bought time with their lives. Scientists unleashed a weapon that should have been impossible. Together they survived. But humanity must not mistake survival for victory. The chamber murmured with confusion. On screens around the world, people leaned closer to listen. Helen said the Kethran Dominion withdrew, but they still possessed hundreds of warships. They could return tomorrow or next month or next year. When they did, humanity must be ready, not just to survive, but to defend their place in the galaxy. She brought up a star map showing humanity's tiny sphere of influence in the vastness of space. For 15 years, humans had been cautious in expansion and afraid of drawing attention. That time was over. The galaxy knew humanity existed and knew they could fight. Now humans must show them they could win. She outlined a new initiative that was ambitious and desperately needed: the construction of a true interstellar fleet. the establishment of fortified colonies throughout human space, the development of new weapons and new technologies and new alliances with whatever friendly species they could find. Helen declared that humanity would not hide and would not surrender. Humans would take their place among the stars not as conquerors, but as defenders of freedom and the right to exist. If any power in the galaxy tried to take that away again, they would learn what the Kithrin learned. Earth does not kneel. The speech was met with thunderous applause, but in quieter moments afterward, world leaders discussed the darker implications. They had won a single battle against a vast empire. The consequences of that victory were unknown. On the moon, Dr. Nathan Pierce oversaw the shutdown of Project Longshot. The weapon had performed perfectly, but the strain had been enormous. The fusion reactor would need to be rebuilt and the magnetic coils replaced. It would be years before the weapon could fire again. He told Claire Wilson that they needed more of these weapons. Longshot was designed as a last resort, but humanity needed first strike capability and deterrent capability. Claire pointed out that it took 6 years and 3 national budgets to build this one weapon. Nathan said then they better get started on the next. In the weeks that followed, humanity's presence in deep space became a subject of intense debate throughout the galaxy. The Kethrin Dominion maintained its silence, but other species began to take notice. Some saw opportunity and others saw threat. All of them saw a new player in galactic politics that had announced itself with a weapon that defied conventional understanding. In a space station orbiting a distant star, an alien merchant watched recordings of the Earth weapon with fascinated horror. She told her companion that humans built a weapon that could destroy their own world if it malfunctioned, and they fired it without hesitation. Her companion replied with one word: humans. It was becoming synonymous with both courage and madness. Remember that name, because they will change the galaxy for better or worse. 6 months after the battle, a small diplomatic vessel approached Earth's orbit. It belonged to the Terrene Collective, which was a peaceful confederation of species that had long suffered under Kethrin aggression. Their message was simple. They wanted to talk. President Helen Carter met with Ambassador Turan in the newly rebuilt diplomatic wing of Orbital Station Sentinel. The alien was insectoid with chitinous plates and multifaceted eyes, but her translator rendered her voice warm and friendly. Turan said her people had waited a long time to see someone stand up to the Dominion. When they heard what humans did and how they fought, the Terrene knew they had to reach out. Helen replied carefully that humanity was not looking for a war with the Kethrin Dominion. Turan said of course not, but humans were not willing to be victims either. That was what mattered. She leaned forward and said the galaxy was vast with hundreds of species and thousands of worlds. Many were peaceful, but lived in fear of empires like the Dominion. The human weapon and human courage had given others hope, given them the idea that perhaps they did not have to be victims either. Helen felt the weight of those words. In defending Earth, humanity had inadvertently become a symbol for others, a beacon of resistance against tyranny. Helen asked what the ambassador proposed. Turan suggested an alliance with sharing of technology and mutual defense. The Terrene had advanced sensor technology and medical knowledge that could benefit humans. In exchange, they asked for protection, and perhaps the knowledge to build their own defenses. Helen knew this moment would define humanity's future among the stars. They could remain isolated and build strength alone, and possibly face the next threat unprepared. Or they could reach out and make allies and risk being drawn into conflicts not of their making. She thought of the 50,000 dead on Mars, of the 63 crew members Lisa Hayes had lost, of all the people who sacrificed so humanity could have this choice. Helen said they should talk. Across human space, the work of rebuilding and expanding continued. New ships were laid down in orbital shipyards. Colonies received reinforcements and better defenses. Scientists and engineers studied salvaged alien technology and learned and adapted and improved. On the moon, construction began on Project Longshot 2 and 3 and 4. Humanity would never again face an enemy with only one shot to save themselves. A year after the battle, Lisa Hayes was given command of a new warship called the Valiant. It was a new class designed with lessons learned from the Kethrin conflict. As she stood on her bridge looking out at the stars, she thought about how far humanity had come. Humans reached for the stars with dreams of exploration and discovery. They found danger and loss and the harsh reality that the galaxy was not the peaceful place they imagined. But they also found strength they did not know they possessed. The courage to stand against impossible odds, the will to defend freedom at any cost. Earth's Railgun had spoken once and the galaxy went silent. But humanity's voice was just beginning to be heard.